Too long, didn't revise.
Yo, first off, apologies that I've got a cold, but today I'm going to go over the Vienna Circle and Wittgenstein. So, in terms of the actual theories, that's verification, falsification, and then language games. So, as for who the Vienna Circle actually were, they were an Austrian group in the 20s who met at the University of Vienna to discuss the philosophy of language. So logical positivism existed before them, like you got people like Hume, etc. It was never called logical positivism back then, but it was mostly developed and pushed forward by them. So it's the whole idea of empiricism and trying to find the meaning of language empirically, so using the scientific method. And so verification and falsification came about to achieve this. I've also linked in Wittgenstein because he was initially influenced by their ideas but broke away from them after a while. So the verification principle is probably one of the only ideas in the entirety of philosophy that is actually of any use, in my humble opinion. And it's basically the whole idea that you've got two types of statements that are meaningful, and then anything that doesn't fall into this are meaningless, as these two types of statements can't be verified. So for the first one, you've got analytical or mathematical statements, and these are ones that are true in themselves. So, for example, 2 plus 2 equals 4. And then synthetic statements, which rely on evidence to be proven. So, for example, I'm a boy. That's meaningful, as you can prove that. My voice. But then also, synthetic statements that are false are still meaningful, as you can verify them. So, for example, I am a girl. You can still verify that, it just so happens to be that it's false. So if you apply the verification principle to religious language is meaningless, as it doesn't fall into either, since you can't prove it as it's metaphysical, and then it's also not true in itself. That part's up for debate though. So the dude you need to remember with the verification principle is Ayer, who wasn't part of the original Vienna Circle. He's a layman philosopher who developed on it in Language, Truth and Logic. So a pretty good quote to throw in is factually significant. That's his definition of meaningful. And he raises this whole issue of historical statements as they can't be proven with evidence anymore. So to counter this, he puts forward two types of verifiability. So you got practical verifiability, which are statements that can be directly verified using our human experience, and then verifiability in principle, which is basically this: in theory, you can verify them, as at some point in human history they were verifiable. So, for example, Charles I got his head chopped off. At some point in human history, that was verifiable, and therefore it is verifiable in principle. So, in terms of the challenges to verification, it's basically just a lot of edgy skepticism. So, in terms of verifying verification, it can't be entirely proven that unprovable statements are factually meaningless. So, for example, you got Hick, who talks about this whole idea of eschatological justification. So, the statement, after you die, you'll go to heaven. For the verification principle, that's a meaningless statement, as you can't prove it, but for Hick, he argues that after death, well, you can prove it then. And so therefore it's still meaningful. And then in terms of accepting evidence as well, to what extent can we accept empirical evidence that we ourselves have not experienced? So I've never been to Mongolia. I'm guessing that you probably haven't been to Mongolia either, and yet both of us are accepting that Mongolia exists. Why? We've never experienced it ourselves. And then for empirical skepticism, that's questioning like the empirical evidence of we ourselves experience. So like if I'm sat in bed and I have like a vision where I see God coming to me, how do I know that I've not just have like some mad fever dream? And then so obviously it's quite hard to argue against skeptical arguments just by the nature of them. So I've given like a point against them here. So this isn't actually a point against verification, and that's Swinburne and the whole idea of like a skeptical bog. So he was a Christian, so he probably disagreed with verification. But rejecting everything leaves us nowhere. But using the verification principle does give us some sort of truths, rather than being in a skeptical bog. So Karl Popper takes the opposite approach to verification, where instead of things having meaning by being able to prove them right, things only have meaning if you're able to prove them wrong. He's a layman philosopher, put it forward in the logic of scientific discovery. So the actual idea of falsifying itself is that statements requiring evidence, so this is basically any theory, so religious statements would fall into this, but like things like analytical or mathematical statements wouldn't, as they're not theories, they're facts. So you must be able to prove them wrong for them to have meaning. So if you have a theory you need provable statements and observations to confirm that theory. And if you have no provable statements or observations, the theory can be rejected as you are unable to falsify it. So for religious statements, you have the theory, but you have no provable statements and observations, so you're unable to prove that theory wrong, and therefore you're also unable to prove that theory right, so you can just reject the theory. So Anthony Flew is the guy who actually applied falsification to religious language. So he pointed out that theists see religious language as factual, but in truth it's actually a theory and therefore needs to be falsifiable to be meaningful. But there's a level of ignorance, so because they see it as factual, they reject falsification evidence, so they ignore provable statements and observations because they view it as a fact. And so they qualify this instead, so they add extra criteria that is also unfalsifiable and accept those as facts as well. So he puts forward like an analogy for it, which is the parable of the gardener. So two explorers come across a flower bed of weeds. One argues there must be a gardener, as there's flowers, and the other argues that there can't be a gardener because there's weeds. So they wait for a long time, but no gardener shows up. And the one who argues in favour of a gardener starts to add in qualifiers. So, for example, if we wait a bit more, he'll appear. So for challenges to falsification, you got like general existentialism, and you can link this to Ayer, who talks about this idea of blicks that are the ways an individual views their life, and blicks can change your behaviour accordingly, and although it's unprovable, it still has absolute meaning to the individual. And then you got this whole idea of a leap of faith, which is put forward by a Christian, Søren Kierkegaard, who argues that not doubting your own faith renders it meaningless, as faith is unjustifiable rationally. So you're actively trying to falsify yourself, and that leaves you with two options. Either first off, give up on your faith, or second off, take a leap of faith, which is deepen it. So religious believers do falsify themselves, and this deepens their faith, which basically goes against what Flew was saying. And then emotional language, the whole like concept of love or any like emotion is unfalsifiable. Yeah, we accept it anyway because we all have emotions. So finally we've got Wittgenstein, who is a layman and philosopher, and after a couple takes I feel like I won't butcher it this time. So his book's called Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, and so he was initially influenced by Vienna Circle ideas, but eventually broke away from them, as he viewed language as non-objective. So language for him is like kind of like a medium used to express concepts rather than words having an intrinsic meaning, which goes against like the empirical views. But he also put forward picture theory, which is that language only has meaning if we can understand or picture in our minds the concept being expressed. However, the theory of Wittgenstein you need to know more about those language games, which are to focus on the meaning of the language used rather than the meaning of the concept. So the language game itself is a unique activity. He gives the example of chess, which contains its own unique vocabulary and terminology. So within chess you got checkmate, promotion, and castling. And so if you're in on a language game, so you understand the terminology being used, it therefore has a personal subjective meaning to you. So if you view religious belief as a language game, since it does contain its own unique vocabulary and terminology, such as Lent, Hajj, salvation, samsara, if you view it as a language game, it has a personal subjective meaning for religious believers. And now we get on to probably the stupidest thing in the entirety of philosophy, and that's coherence theory, which states that if a group agrees on a truth, it is true for them. So because religious believers have a personal subjective meaning for religious language, it is therefore true, apparently, because a group agrees on it. Now, finally, we get on to the best to last challenges to language games. So you can actually use picture theory against language games. Obviously, Wittgenstein's not going to put up two theories that are contradictory. So rather than challenging language games directly, it challenges religious belief being meaningful within language games. So obviously, religious believers understand the language being used within religion, since they're in on the game, so they understand what omnibenevolent means. But they can't picture what omnibenevolence is in their mind, so they don't understand the concept, and therefore it's meaningless. And then you got Russ Rees, who was a student of Wittgenstein, who eventually pushed away from his ideas. So he points out there's an unfair comparison between language and games, as language is far more complex and intricate. I disagree. I play some games online, and Jesus Christ, I understand language far more than that. And so the implications on philosophy as well. So individually, so if you take picture theory out of it, language games suggest there are no facts, So studying philosophy, specifically metaphysics, is useless as no truths can be found between the different games. So, for example, if you take the two statements, after you die you'll be reincarnated, or after you die you'll go to heaven, both of those have like equal meaning, because obviously reincarnation is meaningful to Buddhists because they're in on the game of Buddhism, and heaven is meaningful to Christians as they're in the game of Christianity. And so basically, trying to study philosophy is pointless because you'll never find an answer. Now my throat really hurts, so I'm quite glad that it's the end. Goodbye.